this 3-night series, Epic Fail, Was Darwin Wrong? And we're going to find that out in the next 3 days. And we're very excited to have Mary Jo and Dave Nutty from the Alpha Omega Institute back with us. My name is Jonathan. I'm a pastor, and I work in campus ministry here with Maranatha Christian Fellowship as an advisor. And we love doing these presentations every year because there's always new people coming to the university who we believe needs to hear this information, because primarily what's taught at the universities is naturalism. That is the assumption that everything happened through natural causes. And of course, the main theory that's taught is the evolutionary theory. And so what we're going to be bringing, obviously, is a supernatural assumption. Other words, God did it. And yes, we do believe the biblical account of creation. The unique thing about our speakers, though, is that they are former evolutionists. So they were fully trained in evolution in their university education. And they taught evolution, I believe, at a high school and college level. Yeah. And so it's not like they grew up in the church, and were naturally had a bias towards God creating the universe. They actually had just the opposite. They had an evolutionary viewpoint of how the origins of the universe began. So that's what I really like about Dave and Mary Jo. Dave is a geologist, and Mary Jo is a biologist. And I do believe we have another biologist in the room over here. Leo, is it? Yeah, so you'll get a good critique from Leo over there tonight. So anyways, obviously I'm just a preacher, so I'm not the authority in the science realm, but I do believe that every one of you has a specific call from God on your life. I do believe that there's no accidents in this room. I believe we're all fearfully, wonderfully made by God and in His image, if you read Genesis chapter 1 and chapter 2. And so we just feel like, you need to have a chance to see the other side of the coin, because I don't believe the universities are really doing a good job of helping people critically think, because they're only allowing one viewpoint or one assumption, that is naturalism. And so we feel like for 3 days we get to give the other side of the coin. So this isn't designed to be a debate. In how this meeting will work as simply as Dave and Mary Jo will present their information, and then you might have a really exciting question that's burning in your heart that you want to ask. And so just hold on to it, and you'll be able to ask them that question when they get done speaking. Now, I try to keep them within an hour, so I'm hoping they're going to stay right in there. Dave would speak to you for 3 hours if I would let him.
Yeah, I know.
So anyways, but they've been doing these types of talks now for 40 years. They're actually on their 40th anniversary, their Alpha Omega Institute. So congratulations, guys, on that. So tonight's topic is going to be a biological proofs of evolution fail. The evidence cries out design. And so they're going to focus in on that and talk about that tonight. And don't be afraid at the end of this, if you can't come to the other two presentations, feel free to ask them questions. They probably won't share everything, but they'll definitely give you some solid stuff. And then also, before we turn it over to these guys, I want you to understand we have a information table here for you. Dave and Mary Jo have some flyers here about their ministry and some of the things they got going, and you can sign up and get their newsletter if you would like to. They have a, is it bi-monthly or every month? Every other month newsletter. And then we got information about our worship meetings on campus. We've got some pamphlets here, like one is Scientific Facts in the Bible. You can grab one of those on the way out the door. You can also sign up to receive our emails on the different events that we do as a campus organization and ministry. And then if you've never owned a Bible before in your life, we actually have them here for free. The English Standard Version. So it's a full Bible, Old and New Testament. So you're welcome to take one on your way out the door. Now, if you have 3 at home, please let me give that to someone that doesn't have one, okay? So unless you're going to take it and give it to a friend, all right? Anyway, so without any further introductions here, I want to introduce Dave and Mary Jo, and they'll let you know who's going to speak first. And well, there you go. So let's give them a warm welcome.
That's okay. I think this will work for you.
Okay, we're hoping this will work. you tonight. I talked to a few of you before, we're science majors, a couple of you, and engineering, and philosophy, and, I've already forgotten.
Marketing.
Marketing, that's right, marketing. All right. Anyway, you don't have to be a scientist tonight, okay? Tonight you just need to turn on your thinking cap a little bit. And like Jonathan said, I used to believe in evolution. Now I thought there was a God and I knew Jesus, but I also thought evolution was true. And I thought, well, maybe God used evolution. That didn't work. It was bad science and it was bad theology. And so I totally was trained in the evolution model. I taught it at the, see, I don't know, oh, you gotta find it that way, okay. I taught evolution, I taught it in a high school and then later on in a college level up in Alaska. And that was a neat place to be, really cool. Fun, a lot of fun. But when you look at creation, the creation model that we're gonna look at tonight is the idea that there's a supernatural creator that created us as human beings. The evolution model says now we came from simpler creatures, right? In fact, if you trace it back far enough, they say you just came from a puddle of goo. And so we say evolution is goo to you by way of the zoo, okay? Because supposedly we're related to all these other creatures according to the evolution model. A lot of people think evolution is science, creation is religion. That's what I thought. And actually I went to school right here at MSU, it wasn't called that back then, it was Mankato State College back then. But when I went here to school, I was a biology major, so I had lots of science. But I was always taught that evolution is science. Now they might have told you it's a theory, but it's usually taught as if it's a proven fact. Really, evolution is a philosophy. It's a worldview. It's part of a worldview of naturalism. It's an idea of how the world got here and how we get all the variety that we see in the world today. So evolution is really a philosophy posing as science. It really can never be proven, can it? Because nobody was there to watch it happen. We have lots of circumstantial evidences that we're looking at. But when it comes right down to it, it's really an interpretation. This worldview of naturalism is everything in the universe can be explained only by natural processes without any supernatural. In other words, matter and energy can combine together to explain everything we see in this universe today. And that's the idea of naturalism. So the question is, what is your worldview? What color is the filter that you look at things through? And you know, all through the public schools and here at the university, you're given one set of glasses, basically, one set of colored glasses to view the evidence. But what happens if you put on a different colored glasses to look at the very same evidence? You're going to see different things. And so really this whole evolution creation debate, it's really not a debate of science versus religion. It's really a matter of what is your worldview and how do you interpret the evidence then? Your worldview can affect your interpretation of the data. Because think about it, the data is the same. A rock is the same whether you're an evolutionist or a creationist, right? You take that rock and you grind it all up and you do the chemical analysis, it's going to be the same whether you're an evolutionist or a creationist. The data should be the same, but it's what do you do with that data? It's the interpretation of that data. And so we can have one scientist look at the very same thing as the other one, and one says, wow, isn't evolution wonderful? And the other one's going, what an awesome creator we have. They're looking at the same evidence. We have the same rocks, we have the same plants, we have the same animals. We have all the same kinds of data. We'll take questions at the end, okay? Otherwise, we'll never get through it. So we can look at these things through an interpretive framework. According to evolution, everything started out with a big bang, right? That's what we're taught, at least, usually. That's the basis of naturalism. And this is quite a while back now, but in April of 2002, Discover magazine had this article, where did everything come from? And they say here the universe burst into something from absolutely nothing. Zero, nada. And as it got bigger, it became filled with even more stuff that came from absolutely nowhere. Now, I don't know about you, but to me that sounds like a fairy tale. How could everything come from nothing? By accident, by chance, create you with that wonderful brain that you have in your head there, and your hands that work, and your body that works. I mean, everything is working together. To me, it makes no sense to think it came about simply by accidents and chance. So we're going to look at some more of that in a bit here. And so we have nothing explodes. Well, I don't know about that. That doesn't seem too realistic. Tonight we're going to look at some of the evidences of evolution, and I've just grouped them into 4 groups, just for the sake of simplicity. The first one being change, and then similarity of junk and imperfection. We'll deal with each of those as far as evidences of evolution, and then some of the ideas of why I think they don't hold up. Evolution simply means change. I mean, at the base level, that's what the word evolution means. So if I ask you, do you believe in evolution? Yeah, we all believe things change, right?
Exactly.
But the question is, how much change and what kind of change are we talking about? And where does that change come from? What motivates that change? I mean, are we talking about mega evolution, the whole idea of molecules can turn into man given enough time? Or are we talking about macroevolution, which talks about the origin of new varieties, new types, body types of living things and so on? Or are we talking about microevolution, which is really what we might call adaptation? It's variation within a kind. So you can have frog, the frog kind, but within there we've got all sorts of varieties of frogs. You can have the dog kind, and within the dog type there's a lot of variation. Big dogs, little ones, chihuahuas, Saint Bernards, you know, all different sorts of dogs, and yet what are they? They're dogs. They don't ever change into cats. They don't ever mix with cats or any other kind of animal. They are dogs. Tonight, as we look at some of these common evidences of evolution, and these are some of the typical things that are taught in the museums and the textbooks and so on. Darwin's famous finches being one of these. It's been, for many, many years, used as evidence of evolution. Well, what did they do? They went to the Galapagos Islands, they studied the finches. They looked like they had similar body types, but their beaks were a little different, and there was some variation within these finches. And the idea was that a pair of ancestral finches came over from South America, landed on the islands. Over time, they reproduced, and as they were isolated then from the main continent, they began to develop into different varieties and so on. Okay, is that evolution though? You know, what did you start with here? You start out with what? Finches. What do you end up with? Finches. Nothing fundamentally new. Yes, there's some variation within those finches, but that genetic potential for variation, we believe, was built in from the very start, at least within that finch type. And so we see variation taking place, but not evolution. Many people now are starting to say, well, all those changes are due to epigenetics. Here's one quote by Dr. Jeffrey Tompkins. He says this: scientists have discovered that the genes are very similar among the various species. They discovered that epigenetics correlated closely with beak shape and size among the species. Epigenetic mechanisms clearly remain a major player in adaptation. This is epigenetics for those of you that are not biology majors. Here's a simplified version, is, you know, the DNA molecule, which controls genetics, but attached to the DNA molecule are other substances that can make variations, can turn on, turn off various genes and so on. Very, very important, and it is an up-and-coming field in biology, this whole idea of epigenetics. But what Dr. Tompkins is saying is that, yes, these epigenetic factors seem to influence the kinds of traits that we see coming. Peppered moss often given as one of the best evidences of evolution. And I hope it's not still being taught here. I don't know if it is, if this college, is it still being taught here? Don't know? Okay. The idea was back in Great Britain, before the Industrial Revolution, they say the trees were nice light colored and there were two varieties of moss. There were dark ones and light ones, but the light ones were better camouflaged than the dark ones. So the idea was, well, the birds picked off the dark ones here, and then there were more light ones left. And then the Industrial Revolution hit, and the tree bark became polluted with soot. And after a while, they said, oh, look, now there's more dark ones than light ones, because now they're better camouflaged. Question is, though, is that evolution? Now, usually the book will say something about, this is an example of natural selection. This is how evolution takes place. We don't have a problem with natural selection. Natural selection can work. But the question is, where did you get the variability in the first place? And how far will natural selection go in pushing the direction of a species in these changes? What do you start out with here? Start with moss, black ones and light ones. Usually the books don't tell you about the black ones to start with, but they were both there. And what do you end up with? Moss. They haven't evolved, they haven't changed anything else. All we're seeing here is a relative difference in numbers of light-colored and dark-colored moss. Now, if that's your definition of evolution, we're probably pretty close on the same page. But this does not explain how you can go from molecules to man, because we have these characteristics there to start with, nothing fundamentally new. And now we find out that this whole thing might be very fraudulent, because what do we find? These moths do not even naturally have the tendency to rest on the sides of the trees. They had to be stuck on there to get the pictures that they have in the articles and so on. And so this could just be a bogus, fraudulent example. We don't know that for sure, but that's what it's starting to look like, because they don't normally land on the trunk. They normally will land up in the leaves. They fly around at night, and during the day they hide up in the leaves of the trees. Whoops. What was that all about?
Okay.
Okay. This, there was a book, oops, no. You gotta stand this, you gotta stand this way when you click it.
Okay,
I'll let
that's
you know.
interesting.
So, just in case you wondered.
I'll be there.
There you go. That Journal of Evolutionary Biology in September 2012 confirmed this idea that Jonathan Wells had that said that he exposed in this book the myth of these peppered moths, and it was confirmed later on. Antibiotic-resistant bacteria is another kind of variation among creatures that is oftentimes cited as evidence of evolution. And again, what are they saying? Well, if you take a population of bacteria and you throw an antibiotic on there, what's going to happen? Most of them will die, maybe. Some will die, some will live, right? Those that live go on to reproduce. They probably are resistant to that kind of bacteria. That makes sense. I don't have a problem with that. But the question is, where do they get that bacterial resistance to start with? It's got to start back at the genetic level. And we're talking about adding all kinds of genetic information. If we're going to go from molecules to human beings, think about how much genetic information would have to come about accidentally. Because when you look at the idea of evolution, it's usually based on mutation plus natural selection, right? And what is mutation? It's a mistake. It's a change in the genetic structure randomly. So when we look at these antibiotic-resistant bacteria, yes, we're seeing variation, and yes, some are going to be more resistant to particular kinds of antibiotics than others are. But we start with bacteria, we end up with bacteria. There's nothing fundamentally new, and the population as a whole is less able to adapt because now we've lost some of the genetic variability as we become more and more specialized. So we see variation, yes, but I would not call it evolution, at least not in the idea of macro or mega evolution. What we see instead is variation. Now, you might call that microevolution, but it's a big jump from there to get from molecules to man. What about the races? I mean, how do we get all the various skin colors? According to evolution, well, was Darwin wrong about the races? Darwin actually taught that human beings had come from 5 different species of apes and monkeys, and that they had evolved over time, and some of these races, he called them, were more advanced than others. And so his idea from his book, The Descent of Man in 1871, Darwin believed in white supremacy. His proof was the white men were further evolved than dark ones. Here's a couple of quotes about that. This purported superiority justified to Darwin the domination of what he called inferior races by Europeans. As white Europeans, here's quote, exterminate and replace the world's quote, savage races, and as great apes go extinct, Darwin says the gap between what he called civilized man and his closest evolutionary ancestor will widen. Now, boy, that would not be accepted in most classrooms today here at this university, would it? But that was Darwin's idea back then, and it was consistent with the colonialism of his time and the thinking of his time. But you see how the science was twisted to fit with the thinking of the time. In fact, here says the gap will eventually be between civilized man and some ape as low as a baboon, instead of at present between the Negro or Australian or the gorilla. Darwin's theory claims that Africans and Australians are more closely related to apes than Europeans are. Now, I find that pretty offensive. I would imagine most of you do too. But this was Darwin's idea. What about the Bible? Does the Bible talk about races? Now, really, it talks about languages and nations and tribes and clans, people groups originally based on languages. And so, you know, the Bible is not consistent. The creation, according to Genesis, is not consistent with racism. But evolution is consistent with the idea of racism. That alone might be a good enough reason to reject it. Scientifically, we can look at it and we can show you with a Punnett square. Some of you that are in biology recognize Punnett squares, right? Some of you hate them, some of you love them. But there are means to demonstrate what happens in a genetic cross or mix with the offspring. If we were to start with medium skin colored parents with the maximum amount of genetic variability in one generation, you can get all the way from darkest dark to lightest light. So if this hypothetical couple, if they had 16 children, they'd have one very, very dark child and one very, very light child. Now, we don't normally see that because there's been a little more segregation out of the races over the years, and so we tend to be more up here, more down here, but the middle ones, technically, you have that capability. This is actually a family with medium skin colored parents, 2 little girls, and one of them dark, one of them light. Here they are as they get a little older. In one family. Where's the room for racism there? Certainly doesn't fit, does it? Not at all. Here's another article that talks about how Africans evolved a palette of skin tones. Here's from this article. It says, researchers agree that our early Australopithecine ancestors in Africa probably had light skin beneath a hairy pelt. Did you notice this word? Probably.
Yeah.
Okay, how do we know that? This is the researcher, Tishkoff's team found that the story of skin color evolution isn't so black and white. The study adds to established research, undercutting old notions of race. You can't use skin color to classify humans. There's so much diversity in Africans, there's no such thing as an African race. And what are we looking at? We're just seeing skin colors vary. And I love it. I love the diversity of skin colors. I think it's amazing that our God has created so much diversity in our colors. So we look at some of these modern issues that we face in our society today. Many of them have these evolutionary undertonings if you really start digging back and if you start looking at what Darwin was teaching. In fact, we had a couple of guys that worked with us that went to Africa. They were speaking to a group of African pastors there, and our guys were the only white ones in there. Everyone, all the rest black pastors. And our friend was a little worried. What am I going to say? He got to the point where he showed them this chart that I just showed you about getting all the skin colors. Because one of those pastors came up to him and said, "What kind of monkeys do we come from?" They had been taught that all the way since colonialism. And I went, man, what a terrible thing. After he showed them what I just showed you with that chart, these guys got up and just started praising God. They were so happy to find out that they were equal, and that God had created equality among the races. And so we don't have to worry about these ideas of racism from a biblical point of view. Here's another question. According to evolution, how do you get new genetic information? Because really, that's the crux of the whole thing, isn't it? If you're going to evolve something from molecules to man, you've got to get tons and tons of new genetic information. Where does it come from? Well, Darwin didn't really know. He accepted Lamarck's ideas about the inheritance of acquired traits. He kind of thought that something in your lifetime could be, something that happens to you can be passed on to your children. Like Lamarck thought giraffes at one time were short-necked animals, and then there were droughts, and they had to stretch their neck to reach the trees, and that stretched neck was passed on to the next generation. We don't believe that today, and so that really is not a good model, is it? Darwin really didn't know. Today, what's usually taught is neo-Darwinism, which means evolution proceeds by mutation plus natural selection. So they will tell you mutation is the origin of new traits. And here's a problem for evolution. According to what I understand, neither mutations nor natural selection can create anything. Natural selection can only select from what's there, right? And mutations have to have something in existence already in order to mutate or to change. And so it still doesn't explain where do we get life in the first place, and how do we get the diversity that we see in living things today. And then we got to ask the question, can mutations really produce all of the good, positive things that would have to be produced to go from molecules to man? What do we find? Mutations produce aberrations like two-headed snakes, like cows with extra legs, and roosters without any chickens, and all different sorts of fruit flies. But they're still what? Still fruit flies, right? And you can get a four-winged fly, but it's still a fruit fly. It doesn't ever change into anything else. You just get lots of variations, most of which will not even survive in the natural world. And so according to evolution, you got to have a good mutation which has been saved by being in a particular environment. And then you, not only in humans, you'd have to have that same mutation in the two parents, wouldn't you, in order to be passed on. And so it's not just a random event. It doesn't work that way. Most of us would know that mutations are harmful. When we observe mutations, we see they can result in a duplication of information. They can result in a loss of information, like you could get a four-winged fly, or you can get a fly with no wings, or the deregulation of genetic information like occurs in cancer cells or aging and death. These are all what we find actually happening from evolution. are from mutations. Now there are a few things that people will point to as evidence of a good mutation, but when you really start digging into it, you find out they're only good in a very specific environment, and they actually would result in dying out in any other kind of environment. And we know that mutations are harmful. Dr. John Sanford, he is he used to be an evolutionist. He's a retired Cornell University professor, a genetic researcher. He's done lots of research in this area. He was the co-inventor of the gene gun process by which you can sequence the DNA molecules. Smart guy, but he says this. He wrote this book called Genetic Entropy. Entropy just is a measure of disorder. And what he's saying is, as a result of genetics, that order keeps going down and down and down. It doesn't keep getting better and better and better. And so he says mutational entropy appears to be so large, it's so strong, especially within large genomes, that natural selection should not be able to reverse it. He said it's now clear that mutational selection cannot stop the loss of genomic information. So how could it then create it in the first place? It couldn't. He says this: careful analysis on many levels consistently reveals that the primary axiom is absolutely wrong. Now, what's he mean by the primary axiom? That's the idea that mutation plus natural selection leads to onward, upward evolution, okay? And he's saying it's absolutely wrong. He says this: if mutation and selection can't prevent the degeneration of the genome, then the primary axiom is wrong. It's not just implausible, it's not just unlikely, it's absolutely dead wrong. It's not just a false axiom, it's an unsupported and discredited hypothesis which can be confidently rejected. So if you're in a biology class and they tell you evolution proceeds by mutation plus natural selection, Dr. John Sanford would tell you you can confidently reject that idea. It doesn't hold up to scientific scrutiny. And you can get that book if you want from our office. It's called Genetic Entropy, and study into that a little more if you're interested in that. So mechanisms for evolution, mutation, and natural selection, we can just say no. These things cannot explain the origin of new kinds of living things. They might explain a little bit of variation within that type, but not the origin of new things. The big question is, where do you get life in the first place? You have to go from non-living molecules somehow to living organisms. How does that jump take place? It's never been demonstrated scientifically. It's not been done in the lab. Some of the old experiments that they refer to, like the Stanley Miller experiment and others, they don't hold up when you carefully examine them. So where do you get life in the first place? According to evolution, it's all based on speculation. They tell us life evolved on this earth in a primitive pool of water or something, you know? But nobody was there to observe it. And it's never been observed in the laboratory. So why are we calling that science in these classrooms? And yet it contradicts what we do know about science. One of the very most well-known laws of science that you hit immediately when you get to biology class is life comes only from pre-existing life, right? It takes life to get life. It takes parents to have children, you know? You have to have life already existing. That is consistent with the biblical account, by the way, because where did life come from according to the Bible? It came from the Creator God. Now you might ask, well, where did that life of God come from? And that you have to take by faith and by what the Scripture tells you, that God is eternal. He has eternal life, and so therefore He can create life, because He is life, and He wants to give that life to each one of us. We should reject, as a matter of principle, the substitution of intelligent design for the dialogue of chance and necessity. That's from Franklin M. Howard. and he's talking about the way that cell molecules, organisms in the order of life, how this came about. What's he saying? We're just going to reject the idea of intelligent design. We reject it. We haven't proved it wrong.
Principle.
We just say no. We're just not going to believe it. And then he says this: we must concede that there are presently no detailed Darwinian accounts of the evolution of any biochemical or cellular system. Only a variety of, what's that word? Wishful speculations. Now wait a minute, I didn't know that science was based on wishful speculation. Science is supposed to be based on observation and experimentation, right? The base level of science, not speculation. Now you might speculate to come up with a hypothesis and then go into the laboratory and test it, but you're not going to come up with science with wishful speculations. So we can just say no to these ideas of change that we've looked at. What about similarity? This is the idea that we can look at varying kinds of creatures and we can see structures that look similar. This one is based on structural similarity. They use the term homology, the study of similarity. So you can see there's a similar bones in structures in the man's arm, the dog's leg, the bird's wing, and so on. And you see the similarity there. The question then becomes, what's the origin of that similarity? Why are they similar? Well, one explanation is they're similar because they had a common ancestor, right? Another explanation is maybe they were designed for a similar function, an engineering principle being applied in different ways in different organisms. So what we see is a variation on a theme. Maybe it's an indication that they were designed by the same designer. And that shows there's only one creator God, not a whole bunch of different gods creating things. That could be, this would be similar to going into an art museum and looking in the art museum for all the Rembrandts, for example. You could see evidence of style and color use and so on in theme. Or maybe they're similar because they were designed to work together, to live together in an environment, in the same ecosystem, the same universe. We don't have we have a universe. We don't have a bunch of different universes. Oftentimes they use this little example of gill slits and a yolk sac and a tail, and they say, look, at about 2 months of development inside of your mother's womb, you had all these things that were reminiscent of our evolutionary history. Are they really? Well, you look at it, what do you find out? The gill slits are not gills and they're not slits. They're little pouches develop into the structures of the neck and the jaw region. So why would they call them gill slits except to try to draw attention to how similar we are to fish at that stage in development? The yolk sac is not a yolk sac at all. It's for forming the first blood cells for that little baby till it's big enough to make the blood in the bones and so on. We do this thing they call a tail. Looks a little bit like a tail there, but it really isn't. It just grows a little more quickly than the rest of the little baby. It's just the end of the spinal column. It's got to grow somewhere. And as it grows a little more quickly, it stimulates the growth of the legs and other structures in that area of that little baby. And so we look at those things, and the terminology that was applied to them already assumes evolution. It's already trying to be a support for the evolution model. Back in the 1800s, Ernst Haeckel came up with this idea of the biogenetic law. He put a big, long terminology to it. Ontogeny recapitulates phylogeny. That's a big mouthful. It just means that as the baby develops inside the mother's womb, it will repeat the stages of evolution. And so, in other words, go through a fish-like stage, an amphibian-like stage, a reptilian-like stage, and so on. He drew these diagrams to show how much similarity there really is. Problem was, these are fraudulent diagrams, and people that are in embryology today know they can tell the differences in the different organisms from very, very, very early in development. And so this is just plain wrong. And yet, even in October 2024, they show this. Chicken embryo, human embryo, look at the tail, look at the gill slits, and they're calling it homologous. This is from Evolution at Berkeley Education, Edu. So, you know, still today, that is being taught even though it was disproven years and years ago. Today, what they're really looking at more though is biochemical similarities, or what's called biochemical homology. And to look at the DNA molecule, for example, they compare the structure of those nucleotides, the letters on the DNA. Or they might look at proteins and compare the order of the amino acids in proteins. And from that, they come up with these trees of life. Well, the idea being the more similar our chemicals are, the more closely we're related. Does it work that way? Well, that's how they get the claims like this, that chimps and humans share almost 99% of their DNA. That must prove we came from chimpanzees, or that they're our nearest relatives in the biological world, right? But this 99% is not exactly true, and that has gone down drastically, of 93% there, went down to 86 to 89%. Some people think as low as 70%. But so what? They tell us the mouse is 97.5% similar, so are you more closely related to mice or apes? And zebrafish, 92%. I like this one. Bananas, we're supposedly 50% similar to bananas. Maybe we evolved from bananas. Of course, that's just ridiculous. But what are they doing? They're just comparing the sequences again. What does that sequence mean? It doesn't necessarily mean evolution. It doesn't necessarily trace us to the ancestry. It could be the created ancestry. Replacing Darwin, this is a more technical book for those of you that want something a little more technical. And he's talking about the new origin of species. How do we get new species? Back in 1985, that's a long time ago now, Evolution, A Theory in Crisis was written by Michael Denton. Denton is a molecular biologist. He was not a creationist when he wrote that book. In fact, he pointed out problems that he saw. But what he did was say about this whole idea of molecular homology, he said the really significant finding that comes to light from comparing protein amino acid sequences is that it is impossible to arrange them in any sort of an evolutionary series. He's looking at the actual science. He's saying, as an evolutionist back then, but he's saying it doesn't line up. You just can't do it. And then a little later, you get a quote by Michael Lynch, biologist, clarification of the phylogenetic relationships of the major animal phyla has been an elusive problem, he says, with analyses based on different genes and even different analyses based on the very same genes, yielding a diversity of phylogenetic trees. What's he saying? If you study one chemical, you're going to get one tree of life. If you study a different chemical, you're going to get a different tree of life. The data isn't clearly pointing to one, is it? If there truly was an evolutionary sequence where you went from molecules to man and you could see these branching patterns, if that was true, with all the research coming in today, we should be narrowing down closer and closer to that real tree instead of getting further and further away. New Scientist had this article that said Darwin was wrong, uprooting Darwin's tree. In that article, he posted a picture that he had drawn in his journal, just kind of speculating, looking at it and going, I wonder what might have happened there, you know? And then the article says this: for a long time, the Holy Grail was to build a tree of life. A few years ago, it looked as though that grail was within reach. But today, the project lays in tatters, torn to pieces by an onslaught of negative evidence. And if you look at the article, the negative evidence that they're saying is being produced by the new research into DNA. It's saying, wait a minute, DNA studies do not provide evidence for evolution. You see, The tree of life, one of the iconic concepts of evolution, has turned out to be a figment of our imagination, he says. Science isn't supposed to be imagination, is it? It's supposed to be based on observation. He says, we have no evidence at all that the tree of life is a reality. So why is it still being taught in the textbooks, in the museums, in the media? We continually get this whole idea, and we're being told it's science, but it's not. It's a theory, it's an idea, it's a philosophy. They end up saying this: biology is vastly more complex than we thought, and facing up to this complexity will be scary. I don't think it's scary. I think it's really exciting. The more that we study biology, the more complexity we find. To me, it's exciting, because to me it points to the Creator God, who has wisdom and power and love in what he creates. So this tree of life has been being cut down by science itself, and really it's not a good evidence. What about this idea of junk? This is the idea that they said there were vestigial organs, or things in the human body left over from the evolutionary process. At one point in time, they had a list of 180 different things in our bodies that were supposedly left over from evolution. And they didn't have the same kind of function as they might used to have had. But on that list was the pituitary gland. Now, to call that a useless leftover is not at all the case, is it? Many times today it's called the master gland of the body, regulating all kinds of different chemical reactions. The thymus, tonsils, and appendix are all involved in immunity. Wisdom teeth that they say are just leftovers, guess what? What are they for? Chewing, just like any other tooth. They're just involved in chewing. And so these are not leftovers from evolution. One of the things that then they came up with was, when they first sequenced the DNA molecule, they said 97% of the DNA molecule is junk. It has no function. As a creationist, I said, I don't believe that. I predict that the more that we study, the more we're going to find out that this stuff that they call junk DNA actually has a function. And so the prediction is it's not junk. And then Dr. John Sanford, who I mentioned earlier, said it's becoming increasingly clear that most or all of the genome is functional. It has a function. There was an international research project done a few years ago called the ENCODE project, and they were looking at these sections that were called junk DNA, and out of that they came up with this: almost every nucleotide is associated with a function. The metaphor of junk isn't that useful. In other words, the key point is it's just not junk. Here are some of the things, just a few of the things it's used for: repairing DNA, assisting in DNA replication, regulating DNA transcription, aiding in the folding of chromosomes, aiding in the maintenance of chromosomes, controlling RNA editing and splicing, helping to fight disease, and look at this one, regulating embryological development. If that stuff was junk, none of us would be here, because it's functional in bringing about the next generation and passing on genes from one generation to the next. Tons of articles coming out about that recently. Bottom line, it's not junk. It is very, very important in development. Imperfection, we can look at that, and that's just the idea that says, oh, you know, there's many imperfections in our organs, like the eye. Richard Dawkins said the human eye is an absurd design. He says there's tissue in the front of where the light would come in. He says if you didn't have that, if the eye was designed a different way, we could see more clearly. Problem is, if the eye was designed the way that Richard Dawkins said it should be designed, you'd be blind if you went outside in the bright sunlight for a couple of hours. It just doesn't work. Our eyes are designed perfectly to be a good pair of sunglasses, really, for us. And Darwin, I like what Darwin said about it. He said, to this day, the eye makes me shudder. He was saying that his ideas of evolution by natural selection couldn't explain complex structures like the human eye. And we have a good friend down in Costa Rica. He's an eye surgeon. He does a fantastic talk. He can talk for an hour or more just on the cornea of the eye. I mean, and he will get into the details. He loves to share the details of the human eye. It cannot be the result of just, a little light sensitive spot that, became more and more complex the way they teach in the evolutionary model. Doesn't work. It shows design. The evidence cries out, created with the design. It didn't just happen by accident. Dave's gonna come. I know he's a geologist, but I've got him convinced that biology, living things are more interesting sometimes than rocks.
Yeah.
So he's gonna share a little bit about design.
Yeah, but Dave can make rocks exciting for you.
Oh, yes.
Okay,
He
that's
can do
true.
that.
Anyhow, yeah, we see design all over. We could actually have thousands of different examples of design. I just picked a couple of them here for tonight, and so we're going to look at some of that. I believe the evidence really does cry out things are created with the design. When we go to Costa Rica, we see so many things that are all look designed, and we give creation tours down there, and I think it's really exciting to see it. And I was wondering how you were getting.
You gotta hold it behind
right.
you.
Gotta hold it behind me. Okay. So we give these tours of Yellowstone, Costa Rica, etc. Think about my computer. I'm not talking about this one. This isn't Mac, okay? It's not mine. My computer, at least, is well designed. Okay. I'm sure yours is too. But do you realize that your brain up here
That's his bias.
is better than that computer right there? It works faster, can multitask more, okay? So if my computer or this one was designed and yours is better, guess what? Yours is designed too. That's just kind of an idea of a logic right there. So we see that amazing design feature when we look at that. Okay, the total number of synapses in a brain, your brain, roughly equal the number of stars in 1,500 Milky Way sized galaxies. Is that a lot of connections?
I would say so.
Oh my goodness, yes it is. And to say it just happened by accident? Okay, what does naturalism teach about that? Okay, what would it teach? Here's what they would say. Perhaps an early cell billions of years ago developed a sensitivity to other cells. Then it is conceivable it would be on its way to becoming a human brain. That's a lot of faith, isn't it? That's not specifically science, is it? Not at all. And I say there are two words up here that are really not scientific terms. Perhaps and conceivable. It's just an idea. It's speculation, as Mary Jo was talking about a little bit. According to that, think about just the DNA in your body. That's an actually computer programming language. It is. He says the genome is wait a minute, it's not two-dimensional, is a multi-dimensional operating system for an ultra-complex biological computer with built-in error correcting. Would you like if your computer could correct itself? That'd be great. Built-in correcting and self-modification codes. There are multiple overlapping DNA codes, RNA codes, and structural codes. That's Dr. Robert Carter. He's got a DVD on the high-tech cell. And whenever I read that kind of stuff, it says to me right in the face, designed. It didn't happen by accident. I don't believe so. One of my favorite butterflies in the world happens to be the blue morpho. And by the way, it's blue, right? Wrong, it's not blue. I said, what do you mean it's not blue? I see blue. Okay, no, it's not blue. Actually, here's the underside of that same butterfly. It's not blue there. And when you actually look on the actual scales of that particular butterfly wing, you find out it's clear like your fingernail, unless you painted them, okay? All right, yeah, anyhow, they're clear. So how do you get that blue color? It's actually the light comes in, and the light comes into these scales, but the scales are specifically constructed so that within every one of these little spots, what you're going to see is literally millions of layers. And what happens is the light comes down here, it is structured exactly the right distance to within a quarter of a wavelength of light, and the light comes in, everything is filtered out except the blue, but now the blue just doesn't reflect back. This particular construction makes it so that the blue is amplified back, so that an airline pilot from 30,000 feet in the air can see some more blue morphos on the ground from way up there. Is that amazing? Yeah, absolutely amazing when you actually look at it and what's going on here. Here, the spacing of the laminae must be precisely controlled to a certain fraction of the wavelength. Actually 1/8, approximately 1.4 million layers of these laminae, or layers, are meticulously arranged with incredible accuracy on the wings. All right? Do you think there may be some design there? Kind of looks like it to me, all right? Oh, by the way, I was actually speaking in Costa Rica. I was actually in a church, and I said to the people in the church, the next time you see a blue morpho, which is not blue, I just want you to stop and praise God for his meticulous design. Attention to details. Exactly, right then. A blue morpho butterfly, a nice big one, flew right over the congregation in the church. Isn't that something? Wow, God's timing is perfect. It really was. Yeah, so I enjoy that so much when that happens. Okay, what does naturalism teach about the origin of the eye, the origin of the blue morpho? Well, number one, they'll say, perhaps there was a cell that was sensitive to light. Now it's on its way to becoming an eye, right? Yeah, that's the hope of naturalism. And then they say this, we can imagine mutations in natural selection acting over millions of years might refine or produce systems. Guess what? Here are two words that are not scientific. Imagine and might, right? Speculation is what it is. It's the hope of naturalism. It's a religious idea, not really science. Okay, so every one of the naturalistic explanation, no matter what I bring up here, including the DNA, will be explained by the heroes of time, coupled with mutation and selection. Everyone. So most people will be already convinced that naturalism is correct and you have to explain everything by naturalism. Only natural processes, right? Well, have we been brainwashed to believe that? I think so. I really do. So anyhow, I see design all over. I think thinking is allowed. Okay? Thinking is allowed, and we don't have to just buy that hook, line, and sinker just because somebody said you have to believe in naturalism. If the evidence leads toward creation, toward design, I'd say let's go there. Let's look at it, okay? All right. But keep in mind that what Dr. John Stanford, one of the top genetic researchers across the world, said this: mutational selection can be confidently, mutation and natural selection can be confidently rejected. He said it doesn't work. And yet we always try to say that's what explains everything. No, it doesn't. Well, let me just give you another piece of evidence that I really enjoy. And think about your DNA and how it relates to the machine that's going to give you energy. Did you realize you have machines in every one of your cells? They are actual electric motors. They're machines, molecular motors. It's just absolutely amazing when you actually look at them. All right, now look at the end of your finger. Your little finger. Take a look at that thing. Okay? Do you realize there are more molecular motors and machines at the end of your little finger than there are total electric motors and gasoline engines in the entire world? That's a bunch right there. And you can't see them. They're sub-microscopic, you might call that, okay? And that's what let's just look at one of those machines and think about it. There are over 20,000 types of these motors in humans alone. Howard Berg from Harvard University, who's been studying these things, says these are the most efficient machines in the universe. Wow. And they just happened by accident? I wouldn't say that. Okay. This one I'm going to look at is this particular machine called the synthase machine. Now that sounds like technical stuff, but what is it? It's the energy maker. Okay? It's the energy maker that keeps you alive. Without it, you're dead. Okay? And according to David Godsell, cell biologist, molecular machine modeler, said these are one of the wonders of the molecular world. A wonder. Well, they're all pretty well sophisticated too, so we just have to understand it. How do we get that? Let's say, if we want to make that machine, what are the steps inside the cell? Now get your glasses on, you want to look at that cell. Well, you can't, you won't see it, okay? You want to look at it. But what's going on inside that cell in order to get that machine? We've got to start with the DNA, okay? The first thing that's going to need to happen is you unwind this DNA. And the DNA, one strand of DNA inside the nucleus of that one cell might be up to 1 to 2 meters long. 3 to 6 feet, close enough, right? Wow, that's big. But you have to unwind it. If you want to make a particular protein that's going to make up this machine, you're going to have 32 of them, by the way. If you want to make one of them, you're going to have to take the section of the DNA that's going to code for it. It's the computer instructions to make a protein. You've got to open it up to exactly the right spot. Now, I'm going to say you take a picture of it. We're simplifying this, okay? You've got messenger RNA, you've got all this stuff, but don't worry about the technical terms. But you're going to take a picture of that bit, that little bit. You're going to make a copy because you don't want to use the original, okay? You'll make a copy. Now you've got to transport that copy over into those little polka dots on the nucleus. You know what those little polka dots are called? Okay, it's a big term, don't worry about it. Ribosome, for you biologists, okay? So you take that into the ribosome, and the ribosome is going to take the computer instruction, and it is an assembly machine. It's a factory that's going to put the right, I'm going to say marbles on the string of beads, or the beads on the string. All right, so these are the amino acids, etc. It's going to put the right spot, one in the right spot. And what pops out of that when it's all done, it's an assembly line, boom, 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 is a long string of amino acids. Okay? That's what it is. But now you got to fold it, because it's got to be folded to the exact thing. So you call UPS delivery guy, takes it to this folding machine, and then it gets folded to the perfect shape. Now it can be usable by that machine that it's going to be part of. Okay? Are you with me so far? Is it complex? Oh yeah, really complex. But it's so neat what's going on inside of here. Okay, you got to get this thing. What do you do when you get it folded perfectly? You call UPS. Yeah, it's a long ways from this side of the cell to where it's going to be over here in use. A long way. You have to understand the tininess of all of this stuff. the nanotechnology. And so call UPS, it's going to take this on over to make one of 32 proteins needed in this machine, okay? Wait a minute, did I say UPS? You know what they now realize? Within your cells, every cell, there's highway construction going on. They're called microtubules, okay? The highway construction. And then the UPS guy, called kinesin transport, will actually take the sack full of proteins and deliver them to the right spot in the cell. Now, I understand this is simplified, but at the same time, it doesn't sound so simple. So now you have to have 32 specific proteins. And what's that going to produce for you? You can now have a proton come in. That's what powers this thing. And pretty soon it grinds it together. This is a machine. There's a rotor, there's a stator, and it's grinding this stuff together. And what pops out is ATP. That's your energy, okay? That's what's keeping you alive right now. And so that's the energy producing machine. All of these steps are necessary. You leave out one of them, guess what? You're dead. It's not gonna work, okay? And so when I see something like this, I say, is there evidence of design out there? Yeah, I think so. Everything working and operating just like clockwork here, okay? All right, there's 32 protons, or 32 proteins in here, working like a motor and stator, powered by protons, and now what happens, this thing is spinning 9,000 revolutions per minute. That's fast. It is more sophisticated than any electric motor we have ever produced. Okay? That's in every one of your cells. Again, we're talking about amazing, amazing complexity here, aren't we? All right? I see design. I don't see evolution here. Okay? So somebody asked, is there evidence of design? If we're willing to look at it. If we're willing to see it. I see evolutionists that will just deny that. But what reason did they deny that's design? Because they've been taught naturalism. Everything has to be explained by natural processes. To me, you're not going to do that with this. All right? There's no mutation in natural selection that can work on a cellular level. Period. It just doesn't work that way. All right? Here's the answer that we might hear. One, we can imagine mutation, natural selection. Doesn't work. Won't work there, for sure. But then here's the other one. Even if all the data point to an intelligent designer, such an hypothesis is excluded from science because it is not naturalistic. Feel like you're in a box? If this is what you're taught, you have to believe you're actually being chained to naturalism and you can't think out of that box and say, wow, this is amazing design. Design points to a design nerve, right? And we know that. We know that natural processes have never been observed to produce life, or even a piece of it. All right? Naturalism. I think thinking is allowed. Okay? If we really think about it, we're going to have to say it's more complex than what evolution can produce. All right, thinking is allowed. Okay, that's why I keep saying evolution is a match, and naturalism is a belief system. It poses as though it were science, but it's a philosophy. It is a philosophy, and it's a big faith philosophy too. What's the probability of making even one protein? What's the probability of just in the assembly plant getting everything in the right order? Because if it's not in the right order, it doesn't work. It can be lethal, in fact. What's the probability of it? I did some calculations when I was teaching university statistics. And we found out the chance of one simple protein with one chance in 10 times 10 times 10 times 10, 260 times. You know what that probability is like? It's like putting Jonathan in a spaceship and telling him, hey, you've got to go out someplace in the universe behind some galaxy where I hid your favorite blue marble after I filled up all the universe with red marbles. Yeah, I was the one who took it.
Did you take my blue marble?
I took your blue marble. Huh?
I told you not to touch it.
I know it. Now you have to go find it. What? Jonathan, if he can go out and find that thing blindfolded 3 times in a row, that would be 100 million times easier than making that one simple protein. Wow.
No fair play.
Huh?
No
Yeah,
fair
no
play.
fair praying, Jonathan.
Sorry, Jonathan.
Yeah, I know. No fair praying whatsoever. Just to give you an idea of the immensity of the problem, just to make one protein, I can only put 10 to the 84th power red marbles in this entire universe. Well, I can't do it. That's for sure. Okay. But anyhow. All right. Now, here's something else to think about, though. We're not talking about one simple protein. What are we talking about? It takes 70 proteins just to make DNA, which is going to code for proteins. Then you've got the ribosome, which is the one that assembles a protein. The beads on the string, remember that? Okay? It takes 300 proteins to make up the ribosome. That machine right there, 32 proteins. Do you understand, if you ever knew what probabilities were, you've got this probability, now you're raised to this power, to that power, and all of a sudden you say, that didn't happen by accident. In fact, that's what I told my statistics class one time. I don't know what they teach you about these kind of odds in biology. In statistics, we call that 0. Okay? It's not going to happen by accident, period. Okay.
Jonathan just did that.
Jonathan, did you do that? Did you pray that I quit? No. Anyhow, I'm going to go back. So what are we looking at here? I think the evidence is crying out. Things were created with the design. There's no way that could happen if we're willing to look at the data and look at it from, wow, I don't have to have the naturalistic worldview. Okay? I don't have to have that lens. I can look at it from a creation viewpoint, and I think it makes more sense. All right? And you say, oh, wait a minute, hold on. If it was such a good creation, why is there so much evil in the world today? We have to take the whole concept, the whole biblical thing as well. Not only is there creation with a great design, but then there was a fall. Now sin and death and struggle, decay, mutation entered in. And all of a sudden we have death happening, right? We have all that coming in. That's part of the biblical model, all right? And then later we find out things went from bad to worse, and there was a flood, and then the groups dispersed, okay? And so you see this whole model that we have to understand. That's part of the creationist model, okay? It is. And yeah, you can just look and say, there's a creator God for sure. No problem with seeing that, right? I have a question. What if Darwin had known about cells? What's going on inside it? What about DNA? He knew nothing of what's going on. He thought the cell was a blob of jello-like stuff. Okay? Have to give him credit. He didn't have great microscopes back then, right? But he never knew anything about the UPS delivery guy and the highways that were constructed inside the cell. He never knew a thing about these molecular machines, the 20,000 different kinds in humans alone. He knew nothing about that. So we have to give him a little bit of credit there, okay? Would he still have clung to evolution would be the question. If he was open-minded, probably not. Okay, if he was had a vendetta against God, maybe he would still believe in evolution, right? But I think so. I believe the evidence cries out, things are designed. I think the normal proofs that you've seen from what Mary Jo said tonight, and some of the evidence of design here, I think if we're open-minded about it, I'm gonna have to say it looks like evidence of design wins out. Okay? We're gonna be taking some questions and answers right now, okay?
Okay, so, thank you,
Tomorrow
Dave.
night, fossils. Yep. We're gonna talk about Jonathan here.
Oh.
Oh no. I wanted to beat you to the punch.
Well, we normally do the dinosaur presentation, but
Oh.
anyways, you know, Dave and Mary Jo go
And that's
back.
Thursday night, isn't it?
But we're not doing it this year, but Dave can tell you about when dinosaurs and him roamed the earth together.
Yeah, I was actually feeding them when I was a kid, you know. No.
So anyways, but thank you, Dave and Mary Jo, for
Yeah.
the wonderful presentation. So now we're just gonna open it up to questions here for those of you that have some questions. So you can ask a question and maybe a follow-up question, but we just make sure everyone gets a chance to ask a question here. So if you got more questions, just wait till there's no more questions being asked after you get your initial question and your follow-up question, okay?
Mary Jo can come up here to answer questions.
And so you can ask either one of these guys, Dave or Mary Jo, any questions that you might have. And again, when you do leave, make sure you stop by the information table. And don't forget, we will be here again tomorrow night, the same room, same time, covering what do fossils say about evolution? Nothing, rocks don't talk. And then again, Thursday night, geology. Who's the hero of the plot? Time, water, or catastrophe? So we still got two more very interesting talks coming up. We just focused on one area here today, design, and from a biological standpoint. So anyway, so Mary Jo, why don't you come on up here? And who wants to be the first to ask a question? Anybody want to be the first one? Anybody got a question?
Would somebody want to be the second one? Okay.
So no questions? Yes, right over here. CV.
Mary Jo and Dave, thanks for the interesting presentation. Just want to ask from you, what was for both of you that light bulb moment that really drove it home for you in terms of the creation that really the creator is actually speaking? And then also, how did you then unlearn what you had previously learned for all those years?
That took time, didn't it? He's asking what was the light bulb moment for us when we saw, you know, change from evolution to creation, and then how did we unlearn all that stuff we had to learn before? And I'll tell you what, it didn't happen real quickly for us. We got a book, and we'll talk about tomorrow a little bit, but we found a book in a secondhand store. It was called Evolution, The Fossils Say No. Just a little teeny book. And at that time I thought the fossils were the very best proof of evolution. But I bought that book. I was really feeling generous back then, I guess. It cost me 5 cents. But that book got us started thinking, because up until then, we thought evolution was science. We thought the fossils proved evolution. And everything else I had learned in biology had been interpreted within that evolutionary framework. And so, you're right, there was lots we had to unlearn. And I think the way that it happened for us, at least, we began studying the evidence for ourselves, not just what we were taught in school. And we started looking at the evidence, and the more that we started studying that evidence, the more that we said, wait a minute, evolution doesn't work. And the biblical model of creation we were studying at the same time, and we just became more convinced that creation was more scientific than evolution. It took a long time though to go through, and we, sometimes years later, we would come up with something and go, wait a minute, that's an evolutionary interpretation. And then we, go back and restudy it. So it wasn't just fluence like that. For us, for some people it is, So I don't have a light bulb moment as much as the lights coming on. As
The
far as,
darkness began to fade.
as far as the evolution debate, yeah. Somebody else,
You say that there are no races in the Bible.
pardon me?
You say that there are no races in the Bible, but I'm sure they are.
They're not interested in the book?
Like there are no races in the Bible. You mentioned
Races.
The
Respect of races.
Oh, about the races,
Oh.
yes.
but they're in the Bible, right?
Well, if you look at the biblical record, it doesn't talk much about skin colors. It does, I guess, it says it in one place, it's talking about tigers, can they change
Can they
their-
change their skin?
their spots or
Skin
whatever?
spots, but
So, yes, but God focuses on people groups. God is, in the Bible, we see God as a God of relationships. He's so interested in relationships. And so he created Adam and Eve, and he created them with the ability then to reproduce, to have children, and we begin to see families, and then developing from there, the tribe systems and so on. When we get to the Tower of Babel, what happened? Up until then, everybody, some of you may not be familiar with the biblical account, but the Tower of Babel is talked about in the book of Genesis, and it says that everybody spoke one language up until that point in time. And they wanted to build this tower that would reach to the heavens as a worship thing, really, and as a tribute to mankind's intelligence, really. And God at that time said enough is enough. And he says, if they do this, nothing will be impossible for them. And he confused the languages and scattered the people out around the earth. Now, what we're seeing today, I think it's kind of a reverse. Because we're coming back to that ability to communicate, aren't we? With computers and so on. We're rapidly coming back to that. I don't know what what is that gonna happen on earth as God had said? It would result in evil instead of good. And so where was I going with that? Oh, races in the Bible.
yeah.
And so as these various language groups moved out away from the common tower area, now we can begin to see the racial characteristics cemented more into the various people groups.
I
But God
think
is
one
not,
of the things that's real interesting, just to build on this, is when you look at Noah and his three sons, you got Ham, Shem, and Japheth. Ham actually means like dark or black, and Shem is more like dusty, I think it is, but we do know that Ham was black, and we know that Shem was Semitic or brown, and we know that Japheth was bright or fair, which was white, and so that's where we see three areas where we could potentially draw skin color from. But it's interesting, they were all Noah's sons.
yep,
See, because Adam and Eve had the ability, from what I understand, to have any skin color.
Oh, yeah.
And so, anyways, but then that's where we can see, and one of the talks we used to do on campus quite regularly when we had a brother who did that, O'Ray, you remember O'Ray?
Oh, yeah.
But we would do blacks in the Bible, which is a very interesting study because, there's evidence that Joshua was dark complexion. He was probably a black man. There's evidence that, and obviously the first case of racism we see was with Miriam attacking Moses because he was marrying a black woman, you see. And then Paul, the Apostle Paul, was probably a black man or a very dark complexion. He was mistaken if he was an Egyptian or an Ethiopian. I can't remember, but,
I'm not sure which one.
and, you know, but the race he was, you know, the ethnic group that he was being mistaken to be a part of was predominantly black, you see.
Okay.
And so, not that we, you know, want to focus on skin color, but I think it's important for people who have been oppressed and have been,
Yeah.
the Bible has been used to abuse, like we saw in slavery here in America. There were a lot of people, so-called Christians, that would use scriptures out of context to manipulate people. And so, to a lot of black men and black sisters in America, it's important to see the deep history of black people in the Bible so they can see God has been working through white folks, black folks, Semitic folks, all ethnic groups throughout time. And when you see that in the scriptures, I think that's very helpful. Because I think there's a lie that somehow has been perpetuated that Christianity is a white man's religion. And it's not. It's not at all. It's all nations, all peoples that God has worked through the history of time, and as a matter of fact, it says that every nation will be before His throne. You see. So, anyways, I think it's a very fascinating journey when you start studying this in the Bible, and I found it very helpful. Like as a pastor, when I used to play a lot of basketball over at the rec center at the University of Minnesota when I pastored up there. And I would talk to young black brothers, and when I talked to them about black folks in the Bible, it just perked them up. They wanted, really? There's black people in the Bible, you know? And because they're under that mindset, at least not all, but a lot of them were under the mindset that it was a white man's religion. When you could see that what Joshua might have been a black man, and Nimrod started seven cities we see in the early history of Genesis, and you start seeing how actually probably the first 2,000 years of history, black folks ruled the earth, you know? And then you had the Semitic for 2,000, and then you had white folks now for the last 2,000 roughly dominating in the earth. And guess what? All had slaves, all screwed up, all have a sin nature, and all have abused power and abused each other. And so now you begin to go, because we only remember most recent history usually, you know? And so that's a very fascinating study, just from, you know, obviously this isn't their talk, but this is just stuff that I've looked at, and I find it very helpful and engaging to talk about these things, so.
Yeah. Another question or comment?
All right. Well, great. Well, we appreciate you all coming tonight. I hope that some of you will return for the other talks. And once again, thank you, Dave and Mary Jo.
You're welcome.
And feel free, if you want to just ask them questions more privately, you can do that. They will be here. We're not going anywhere. So don't forget to stop by the table, and please invite other people for the next 2 nights.
Make sure they get one of these too. Discover Creation, the Alpha Omega Institute basically says, you have likely been taught evolution is a fact, and that the Bible is full of errors. Could you have been brainwashed to believe that? All right, brainwashed? Who, me? Okay, there's some things to consider in here, and some evidences of design in here as well. So make sure you pick up one of these.